I want to begin tonight with a story that I've heard years ago. It may be apocryphal. I'm not 100% sure if it's true. I haven't been able to track it down. But even if it's apocryphal, I think the point is well taken. The story is about Elie Wiesel, who was an interfaith conference in France many years ago. And he was invited to give the talk, and of course he speaks about the Holocaust. When his talk is over, one of the Catholic participants confronts Wiesel and says, "Wiesel, every time we hear from you, it's the Holocaust, the Holocaust, the Holocaust. That's all we hear about is the Holocaust from you." So in this story that I heard, Wiesel says to the fellow, "Well, you're right." He said, not too many years ago, 6 million Jews were killed in Europe, and I do speak about it a lot. But it's interesting that 2,000 years ago, one Jewish person was killed, and you haven't let us hear the end of it yet. 2,000 years, we've been hearing about this one Jewish person that was killed, so it's true I speak about the Holocaust. The class tonight will be to try to examine the 2,000-year-old phenomenon of Christian anti-Semitism, and think more accurately called Anti-Judaism. Let's just begin at the beginning, the basic storyline of Christianity. 2,000 years ago, approximately Jesus claims to be the Jewish Messiah and attracts a very small following among the Jews. But basically, mainstream Jewish community at the time does not really take his claim seriously. There isn't much that he demonstrates to give them any reason to believe he is the Messiah. And then certainly after 3 years after he makes the claim, he's murdered by the Romans, and it's very clear to everyone that he was not the Messiah. That really should have been the end of the story. But we know what happens though. Followers insist that even though he died, he still is the Messiah, and that he will return and bring about the fulfillment of the Messianic promise. So there is a small group of Jewish followers of Jesus that basically stay in the area of Jerusalem. They never started a new religion. They maintain their practice of the Torah, and they maintain their belief that Jesus would come back one day and bring about the Messianic age. But this movement has never gained an attraction to the Jewish world. It's a small little sector. About 20 years later, there is someone who claims to be from a Jewish background, but who grew up in Tarsus, outside of Israel, and his name is Saul. And what he claims is that even though he originally was an opponent of this Jesus movement, that he had a personal encounter with Jesus. Jesus appears to him in a vision, and he then dedicates his life to sharing his faith in Jesus. And Paul travels around mainly in the Greek and Roman communities of Asia Minor outside of Israel, spreading his teachings about Jesus. His teachings about Jesus are quite different than what was believed and practiced by the Jewish followers of Jesus back in Jerusalem, and his movement begins to spread. A tremendous number of converts amongst the former pagans that he meets. Okay, while this is going on, though, there's tension between the original Jewish followers of Jesus back in Jerusalem and over the Torah, because Jesus speaking how important the Torah was, and that he didn't come to abolish the Torah, and how keeping the Torah is essential if someone's going to have a relationship with God. And they are constantly hearing that Paul is teaching something different, and that they knew that Paul is someone that never actually met Jesus. And yet Paul claims that Jesus made him an apostle just on the same level of the 12 apostles that Jesus personally appointed. And you know, the followers have questions. Who is this Johnny come lately that's preaching this different message about Jesus? And now he's leading a competitive Jesus movement that's attracting many, many followers. That's basically the story of the Christian Bible. Okay? The problem, as Christianity develops, we know what happens, that in the year 70, Jerusalem is destroyed. Many, many Jews are killed, in a small group of Jewish followers of Jesus basically are decimated. They're scattered. They press on for another 100 years, and eventually they disappear from the face of the earth. What became a historical movement of Christianity was Paul's outreach to the Gentiles. The problem for Christianity is very simple. Jesus belonged to the Jewish nation, and he proclaimed his message to the Jewish people. The Jews, therefore, were the one group of people in the world capable of validating his message, but they didn't accept Jesus. And the early church was therefore confronted with the terrible fact that the Jewish people, merely by living and existing as Jews, basically constituted a continued threat to the legitimacy of Christianity. So the question is, how would Christianity perceive and succeed? And their approach was essentially to discredit their adversary with a constant attack. And so the constant aim of Christian propaganda begins with the Christian Bible, is to discredit and defame the Jewish people. Professor Roy Eckhart wrote, "Foundations of anti-Semitism and the responsibility for the Holocaust ultimately lie in the Christian New Testament." We're going to study at the beginning of tonight's session a number of passages in the Christian Bible. We don't have time to go through all of them. There's just so much for us to look at, but we're just going to point out some things that were interestingly done not long ago. It was a study done by Christian lectionaries, with collections of books that collected verses from the Christian Bible that were read in church, almost like the Christian version of the Siddur, right? That there were readings that were done in church. So in these books called lectionaries, they were collecting verses that would be read in the church services, and they found that these lectionaries contained a very high percentage of passages in the Christian Bible that were defamatory to Jews. Some of the studies that were done, just an example, in the book of Matthew alone, there are 90 such passages. In Mark, there are 40. In Luke, there are 60. In John, 130. In the book of Acts, 120. So the Christian Bible is chock full of material that we can explore tonight, and and we'd be able to cover more ground, but we're only going to look at a number of passages tonight. Okay, the first passage we're going to look at is from what is probably the very first book that was penned in the Christian Bible. Interesting that the Christian Bible assembles its books not in chronological order. The Gospels appear first, and the Gospels are written somewhere between the years 70 and 100. But the passage we're going to look at from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 is written approximately the year 50 by Paul. And again, many scholars maintain this is the earliest document that was written that became part of the Christian Bible. So in the second chapter of 1 Thessalonians, Paul writes in verse 14, "For you, brethren, became imitators of the churches of God in Christ Jesus that are in Judea. For you also endured the same suffering as the hands of your own countrymen, even as they did from the Jews, who both killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out. They are not pleasing to God and are hostile to all men." That's a fairly serious charge, that a whole race of people, a whole religion, all the Jewish people are not pleasing to God, all of them, and we're hostile, not just to a few people, but to all men. And again, they killed Jesus and the prophets. Verse 16, which you don't have in front of you, goes on to say, these Jews were forbidding us to speak to the Gentiles that they might be saved, for the wrath has come upon them to the uttermost. See, here you have what is considered to be one of the most anti-Semitic passages in the Christian Bible. And again, there are numerous such passages. In the Gospel of Matthew, which many scholars believe that was written around the year 80, you have one of the most infamous and notorious chapters in the entire Christian Bible, chapter 23 of Matthew, where I don't quote the whole chapter, I just quote a few verses, but the whole chapter basically is pretty much the same. Jesus says to the Pharisees, woe to you scribes, and the Pharisees, he calls them hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one cross-eyed, and when he becomes one of you, you make him twice as much a son of yourselves. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, but have neglected the way of your provisions of the law, justice, mercy, faithfulness. But these are the things that you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. So you testify against yourselves that you are the sons of those You are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Spill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How will you escape the sentence of hell? It's not clear, at least for someone who's reading this as an outsider, that this is necessarily what Jesus said. Either these are words that Jesus hurled at his opposing Jewish community, or it's possible that Jesus never said any of this, or most of it. And these are words that were put into his mouth later on by the writers of the Christian Bible, who love to give this impression that there is this incredible tension between the Jews and Jesus. It's quite possible that that hostility wasn't there, and there was a reason to seem as if the real enemies of Jesus were the Jews. Again, the other possibility is that there was this terrible hostility between Jesus and the Jewish people. One of the constant themes and the refrains of the Christian Bible is that the Jewish teachers and Judaism is superficial. Jewish teachers are hypocrites because they practice sort of a formal, superficial kind of religious formalism, which is not really righteousness. It's just religion. It's just show. It's just a front. And there is a constant attack in the Christian scriptures against the kind of Judaism that was practiced by the Jews at that time. In the Gospel of Luke, written about the year 90 in chapter 11, Jesus here says to the Pharisees, woe to you Pharisees, because you have given God 10th of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. So you do all these rituals, things, but you don't really have any spirituality about you. You should have practice in the matter without leaving the former undone. Woe to you, because you built tombs for the prophets, and it was your fathers who killed the prophets. So you testify that you approve of what your forefathers did. They killed the prophets, and you build their tombs. Because of this, God in his wisdom said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom will kill and others who will persecute. Therefore, this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, this generation will be held responsible for it all. Hard to understand how anyone at that time could say that the Jews living 2,000 years ago were responsible for killing all the prophets from the time of Abel up until Zechariah the prophet. That's again part of the history that you'll find in the gospel. On the next page, we have from the Gospel of John, just about the notorious passage in John's Gospel. The latest of the Gospels, written scholars think around the year 100. And what's interesting about the Gospel of John is that here you don't have Jesus referring anymore to particular groups of Jews like the scribes or the Pharisees or the Sadducees. In the book of John, over 100 times, it becomes simply the Jews. That's the referring to the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. So here in chapter 8, verse 42, Jesus said to them, "If God were your Father, you would love me. For I proceeded forth and have come from God. For I have not even come on my own initiative, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I am saying? Is it because you cannot hear my word? You are of your father, the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning, and he does not stand the truth because there's no truth in him. Wherever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature. He is a liar and a father of lies. And because I speak the truth, you do not believe me. Which one of you convicts me of sin? If I speak truth, why do you not believe me? He who is of God hears the words of God, and for this reason you do not hear them, because you are not of God." What an incredible accusation to the entire Jewish people. You're called children of the devil. And what's incredible is we're going to see as we go through the next 2,000 years, the very theme that are hurled at the Jewish people from the Christian scripture are the very same themes that are picked up over and over and over again without change. In the book of Revelation, chapter 3, this again, scholars are not sure when it's written, but pretty late. They think at least in the year 100. Behold, in verse 9, I will cause those of the synagogue of Satan, who say that they are Jews, but are not. They lie. I will make them come and bow down at your feet, and make them know that I have loved you. Now, who is the synagogue of Satan? So I have a little passage here from the MacArthur Study Bible. This is from one of the famous and well-known evangelical scholars alive today. I think it's John MacArthur in his name. He writes, although they were Jews physically, they were not true Jews. But spiritual pagans, with the rejection of the Messiah, Judaism becomes as much of a tool as Satan, as emperors worship. And here we have a second theme that's developed in the Christian Bible. The first theme I mentioned was trying to paint the Jewish people as superficial, as evil, as hypocrites, as vipers, every kind of accusation against the moral corruption of the Jewish people is the first of the themes that developed in the Christian Bible. That's including now what John says, that they were also demonic, children of the devil. But here in the book of Revelation, you hear hinted at the idea that they were real Jews, and there are people who are not real Jews. And here basically you have the idea that those Jews who reject Jesus, they are from the synagogue of Satan because they're not really Jewish. They're only Jewish physically. You see, the same idea developed in the book of Romans written by Paul around the year 57 in chapter 2. Romans verse 28, Paul says, "For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart and in the spirit, not of the letter." So again, the question is, who is a Jew? And one of the themes that we see that the Christian Bible develops is the idea that with the rejection of the Messiah, the Jewish people forfeit their claim to be even called Jews. And they're not real Jews. The real Jews we're going to see becomes the church, the followers of Jesus. So Matthew says in chapter 21, verse 43, "Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to a nation bearing the fruit of it," meaning that the Jewish people are basically going to be disenfranchised. This is referred to as supersessionism or replacement of theology, that because of the Jewish people are deemed evil by God for rejecting the Messiah. God rejects the Jewish people and annuls the covenant with the Jewish people. The church is now the new Israel. Against the theme that will be repeated and repeated again throughout Christian history. Okay, we turn to page 3, we get the last of the 3 themes that are developed in anti-Semitic Christian literature. This is the charge of deicide, Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, again, from around 80 of the Common Era. Now it was the governor's custom at the festival time to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. Here what happens in this chapter is that Jesus has already been arrested, thrown into prison. Matthew claims that there was a custom that Romans had of releasing one prisoner at every Jewish holiday. Okay, this was the time of Passover. At that time, we're told that they had a prisoner named Jesus Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate, who was the Roman procurator at the time, asked the people in the Jewish crowd, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he knew that it was in that self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him, but the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release?" he asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "And what shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him, crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." So when Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hand in front of the crowd and said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility." And all the people answered, "His blood is on us and our children." In the book of Acts 5, probably written, it's not clear, but somewhere around the year 90, Acts chapter 5, verse 30, "The God of our fathers raised up Jesus, who you had put to death by hanging him on a cross." And they're not speaking here to the Romans. They're speaking to the Jews. In the book Acts 7:51, "You men who are stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears are always resisting the Holy Spirit. You are doing just as your fathers did. Which one of the prophets did your father not persecute that they killed? They killed those who had previously announced the coming of the righteous one whose betrayers and murderers who have now become." So here we have the 3 themes of the Christian Bible: Jews as morally corrupt and as demonic, Jews basically being stripped of their status and replaced by the church because of their crimes, and finally emphasis on the focus on the charge of deicide, that the Jews, in rejecting and killing Jesus, have rejected and killed God in the flesh. Okay, over the next several hundred years, we have the early formation of the Christian church, which the writings of the church fathers and the church becoming really a formal institution that starts to spread throughout the world. And here we have what is referred to as the parting of the ways. That with the publication of the Christian Bible and the spread of Christianity, there's a tremendous effort to divide the church from Judaism, much in the same way that Muhammad wanted to make sure that Islam was going to be different from Judaism after the Jews resisted his claims to being a prophet. Originally, Muhammad had many practices similar to Judaism, and when the Jewish people did not accept him as a prophet, he then changed those practices to be in opposition to Judaism. So the church starts to replace Passover with Easter, Sabbath becomes a day on Sunday, many other changes established. When Constantine established Christianity as the official state religion, he adopted a policy of segregating Jews so that the faithful Christians would not be polluted by fake Jewish teachings, and Constantine himself observed that no Jew could ever lose the stigma of their father's denial, murder of Jesus in the 1st century. There was a writing called the Letter of Barnabas, which spiritualized Hebrew scriptures, claiming that the only thing the Jewish Bible did was prefigure Jesus and the church. That was the message of the Jewish Bible. It wasn't about the Jewish Bible. It was about Christianity. Ultimately, again, in the same way that Islam made a claim that the Jewish scriptures only pointed to ultimately Islam, and tried to say that Abraham was a Muslim. That's the same thing that the early Christians did, was to expropriate the Jewish Bible for themselves. The great church fathers said that the church is the new Israel. Again, one of the great early church fathers in the 2nd century said to the Jews, the scriptures are not yours, but ours. Christians have now become the true spiritual Israel. Irenaeus, who was the bishop of Lyon, again in the 2nd century, said the Jews have been disinherited from the grace of God. Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century, and again, these are not Christian, they're not Christian, these are not peasants. They were not that they were sophisticated. These were the great leaders and the teachers of church. I'm quoting now. Clement of Alexandria said the scriptures have become the sole possession of the church because only the church can understand the scriptures properly. One of the great church fathers in the 2nd century, Origen, wrote that the culprit in death of Jesus was not Pilate, but the Jewish people who were punished by being crushed in a war and scattered all over the world. And Christians have always seen the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem as proof that God was through with the Jews and rejected the Jewish people as a punishment for rejecting Jesus. Punishment for rejecting Jesus' origin spoke a lot about replacement theology. He cast the Jewish people, the older brother, and the church as Jacob, the younger brother, who is to prevail over the older brother. And he said, the closeness of God has been removed from them, and transferred the church of Christ and the blood of Jesus falls, not only on the Jews of that time, but on all generations of Jews up until the end of the world. The Jews for all time guilty of everything in the 3rd century. From Carthage, in his treatise against the Jews, that announced that God had rejected the Jews in favor of the Christians. And in the study of 32 of Tully extant works, they found that anti-Judaism played a significant role in 27 of those 32 works. One of the most notorious anti-Jewish preachers was someone named John Chrysostom in the 4th century. He was hailed and still is held in the church circles as the golden mouth preacher. He was considered to be one of the most spiritual people that ever lived. His sermons are still studied by seminary students. He says that the Jews are the most miserable of all men, lustful, greedy, bandits, inverted murderers, destroyers, men possessed by the devil, debauchery, and drunkenness had given them the manners of the pig and lusty goat. They are pests of the universe. They have surpassed the ferocity of wild beasts, for they murder their offspring. This synagogue is worse than a brothel. It's a den of scoundrels and the repair of wild beasts. A temple of demons dedicated to idolatrous cults, a cavern of devils, a criminal assembly for their crime of deicide. There is no expiation possible, no indulgence, no pardon. Their odious assassination of Christ was the origin of all their woes. God hates you. It is incumbent upon all Christians to hate Jews. Anyone who has any time persecuted, tortured, or massacred Jews has acted as an instrument of divine wrath. Thus spake one of the greatest Christian preachers of all time, also in the 4th century. Gregory of Nyssa, the bishop of Cappadocia, wrote that Jews are slayers of the Lord, murderers of the prophets, adversaries of God, haters of God, men who show contempt for the law, foes of grace, enemies of their fathers' faith, advocates for the devil, brood of vipers, slanderers, scoffers, men whose minds are in darkness, leaven of the Pharisees. It's interesting, by the way, if you consult with many dictionaries today, the word Pharisee is defined as a religious hypocrite. That kind of association with the Pharisees didn't come from studying the Pharisees. It came from studying the Christian Bible and the early church fathers. He calls the Jews assembly of demons, sinners, wicked men, and haters of righteousness. St. Jerome, also in the 4th century, depended on Jewish help to help him translate the Greek New Testament into Latin. He wrote that all Jews were Judaists and evil creatures who betrayed the Messiah for money. Jews, he said, are serpents. They wear the image of Judas, and prayers and psalms are like the braying of donkeys. He urged the persecution of all Jews who would not convert to Christianity. St. Augustine, the 5th century, had a basic understanding of the Jewish people, coming from the story of Cain and Abel. But his lesson was not the lesson of being our brother's keepers. Augustine's spin on the story of Cain and Abel was that all Jews are cast as Cain. And our faith, just like Cain's fate, is to wander and suffering, example of what it means to reject and murder God. In Augustine's famous sermon against the Jews, he suggests that even though the Jews are guilty of terrible crimes and deserve the most severe punishment for putting Jesus to death, God has kept them alive to serve as witnesses to the truth of Christianity, as witnesses people. He wrote, "Let them live among us, but let them suffer and be continually humiliated." Saint Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, endorsed the burning of synagogues, which he characterized as home of unbelief, a house of impiety, a receptacle of folly, which God himself has condemned. You see, another one of these church fathers wrote that the promises of the Hebrew Scriptures were for the Christians and not for the Jews. Although all of the curses still belong to the Jews. He wrote that God has cast away his people and transferred his love to the Christians. He taught his followers that Jews crucify Christians everywhere. Saint Zeno, who is the Bishop of Verona, expressed his great disappointment after a raid of monks who looted and destroyed many Jewish homes, ultimately murdering many Jewish people and burning their bodies. Saint Zeno was disappointed because he felt that many more could have been killed. Pope Gelasius I in the 5th century wrote in the Bible that the whole is often named after the part, and Saint Judas was called the devil and the devil's workman. He gives him to the whole race. Jews are called Jews because we come from Judas, the devil. Now, I was as a kid several times asked by non-Jewish children, where are my horns? That was not something uncommon, many years ago. I'm not sure today that happens, but when I was a kid, several times I remember specifically being asked, where are my horns? This was an idea that didn't start 30 years ago. This goes back to the early days, the Christian Bible, that Jews are of the devil, and it's been repeated and repeated and repeated. During the early days of the Christian church, there were several emperors who at church sanction began to pass anti-Jewish legislation. One of the first was Theodosius II, who propagated what is called the Codex of Theodosius, which forbade Jewish people from holding public office and included many other restrictions. His codex became a model for all later anti-Jewish legislation. Later on, a few years later, Emperor Justinian expanded Theodosius' codex and issued his own codex in the year 534. He also plundered many synagogues and turned them into churches. It's not uncommon that between the 4th and 7th centuries, many synagogues were destroyed in the Roman Empire. Not coincidental that the Nazi Holocaust began in 1938 with the destruction of the synagogues. In the early Middle Ages, Pope Urban II in 1095 launched the first crusade to liberate the Holy Land from Islamic hands. Edward Flannery, a Catholic bishop who wrote a famous book called The Anguish of the Jews, quoted the Crusaders in France who said, "We desire to combat the enemies of God in the East, but we have under our very eyes the Jews, a race more inimical to God than all others. we're doing this whole thing backwards. And so hordes of nobles and knights and monks and peasants who set out originally to free the Holy Land from the Muslim infidels suddenly turned on the Jews in their own communities. With the expression, kill a Jew, save your soul, and the church leaders promising that one's sins would be forgiven if they killed Jews, the Crusaders butchered thousands and thousands of Jews throughout Europe. When they finally came to Israel, the small Jewish community in Jerusalem sought refuge in the synagogue, and the Crusaders set the synagogue on fire, marched around singing Christ we adore, while the 969 Jews all burnt to death alive. During the times of the Crusades, anti-Semitic massacres took place throughout Europe. In Regensburg and Prague, thousands of Jews chose death over baptism. The Jews of Germany were taken to the Danube River. They were offered to either convert, or if they did not convert, they would be drowned in the river, which is what happened to them. More than 800 Jews were killed in Worms. 1,000 Jews who refused to be baptized were butchered and maimed. 12,000 Jews were killed in the Rhine Valley alone in the first Crusades. And there were an additional 8 Crusades that lasted until 1272. In the year 1262, nearly 2,000 Jews were killed by Christian mobs in England after they were egged on by church leaders. All of London Jewry were arrested in 1279, and 280 of them were executed in the year 1290. All the Jews of England were expelled at the urging of the Archbishop of Canterbury. There were some church leaders like Bernard of Bordeaux who spoke out against the mass murder of the innocent Jews. He was one of the most influential monks in all history. He was famous for his great love of God, and even though he urged the Jewish people not be killed, this is what he had to say about the Jewish people. They have a stupidity, bestial, and they have the intelligence that is coarse, dense. They were evil seed, nothing in them that was not crude or coarse, be it their occupations, their inclinations, understanding, or even their rights, which they worship God. They were a race who had not God for their father, but were of the devil, and were murderers as he was a murderer from the beginning. This is a great friend of the Jews. During the Crusades, approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire Jewish population of Germany and northern France were murdered during the First Crusade alone. After the first 2 Crusades, the German Jews appealed to the crown for help and for more protection. They had to pay vast sums of money, becoming the king's property. The custom was custom of Jewish people having to pay protection money, spreading to other countries, and church leaders justified all this by saying that the Jews were doomed to perpetual servitude for betraying the Messiah. After the Crusades and during the Middle Ages, the big problem for the Jewish people was that they were only non-converted minority in all of Europe. That was not good for the Jews. And so the theologians during the Middle Ages picked up from where the church fathers left off. In one study, 100 medieval Christian theologians, it was found that anti-Judaism was a very strong theme in all of their writings. Pope Gregory II mandated severe restrictions against the Jew and outlawed their public employment. The Jews were, for crucifixion of Jesus, assigned them to perpetual servitude, and the Jews were forced into money lending, which was forbidden to Christians, and so the Jews gained the reputation for being greedy, and it still persists to this day. In 1290, all the Jews of, you guys have this, were expelled, as I mentioned, that they were taken by the Dukes of France, page 4. But they were expelled repeatedly from France, always allowed to return, until even from France they were finally exiled, and banished for good in 1394. before. In 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, called by Pope Innocent III, there was a decree that Jews would have to wear distinctive dress. This often included what was called a badge of shame, some kind of a badge, often a circle, sometimes it was yellow. And this trend, having to wear this distinctive dress, was spread to Italy, France, Spain, Germany, Poland, and there were many different papal edicts that sometimes required Jews to wear special hats that were funny-looking hats, often had a horn coming out of it, because the horn was supposed to look like the devil. In 1267, the Synod of Vienna had Jews wear these special horn hats. Jews sometimes had to wear yellow collars, or red aprons or veils and hoods, and women had to wear bells on their dresses. And some of these codes were in effect until the 1700s. Now, in 1348 through 1349, one of the greatest tragedies and disasters of the Middle Ages took place with the bubonic plague spreading and wiping out about 1/3 of all of Europe's population. Page 6. They noticed that the Jews didn't seem to be dying in the same numbers. It was quite possible that Jews may not have been affected as badly, although many thousands of Jews did die. But Jewish people have, we know, special sanitary requirements. We wash our hands in the morning. We bury our dead immediately. And it's possible that because of these sanitary hygiene requirements, Jews may not have suffered as badly in the bubonic plague. Nonetheless, we were blamed for the entire plague. It was claimed that Jews secretly contaminated the wells of Europe with a poisonous mixture of spiders, frogs, lizards, and the hearts of Christians mixed together with the elements of the crackers of the communion services. The Jews came up with the concoction and poisoned the wells. As a result of frenzied mobs of Christians set upon their Jewish friends and neighbors, over 200 Jewish communities throughout Europe wiped out. In Poland, where they escaped relatively lightly, over 10,000 Jews were killed, but many more than 10,000 were killed just in the 3 cities, Maine, Brea alone in Germany, and all hundreds of thousands of Jews were butchered by frantic Christian mobs during the Black Plague in Germany, where the massacre were. This is 4528. The entire Jewish community was basically or nearly exterminated. We know that during the Middle Ages, Jews were often required to live in special areas, that they were prevented from owning land, they were limited to their vocations, they were restricted tremendously, and ultimately impoverished. One of the other incredible accusations leveled against the Jewish people during the Middle Ages was that we were thought to worship Satan in our synagogues, and the accusation often held against us was that we would break in the churches, steal their communion wafers, bring them back to our synagogues where we would use them and offer up prayers to the devil, and we would take knives and we stuck them into these communion wafers to torture the body of Jesus over and over. And of course, this was a time, Protestant Reformation, that Protestants believed that the wine and the wafer had just become the body and the blood of Jesus, not symbolically, but the time in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church believed in the transubstantiation, that they believed that the wine is literally the blood of Jesus and the wafer is literally the body of Jesus. So they saw that the Jewish people sticking knives into the wafers repeatedly to torture Jesus over and over again. And in some occasions, people who have claimed to witness these tortures claimed that the crackers and the matzahs, moans and screaming and cryings came out of these crackers and matzah brow crackers, and blood was gushing out of the matzah crackers. In 1243, Berlin's entire Jewish community was burned alive for allegedly torching wafer in the first of these such cases. In 1298, not long after Rodin, Jin's entire Jewish community was burned at the stake after being accused of desecrating the host, and their attackers then went on massacred Jews elsewhere. in Germany, Austria, according to some estimates, killing over 100,000 Jews and decimating 140 communities. In Prague, the year 1389, the Jewish community was accused of attacking a monk who was carrying a wafer, and the Jewish neighborhoods in Prague were surrounded by Christian mobs and offered a choice of baptism or death. 3,000 Jews were ultimately murdered. A charge of host desecration was reported as late as 1836 in Romania. These ideas do not die out. One of the most accusations that was leveled against the Jews in the Middle Ages was the blood libel. The first accusation was made in 1144 against the Jews of Norwich, England. It was claimed they took a Christian child before Easter, tortured him with all the tortures that Jesus was tortured with, and they crucified the child and buried him. A Jewish convert to Christianity testified that Jews were required to sacrifice a Christian child each year, the choice and place being made at an annual convention of rabbis. One of the greatest sources of trouble in the Jewish community during the Middle Ages came from converted Jews. Jews that converted to Christianity became the most vicious and brutal persecutors of their own people. In 1255, a Christian boy named Hugh of Lincoln in England, who was missing for 3 weeks, was found dead. Jews had recently come to Lincoln to celebrate a wedding. When they found a little Hugh, it was claimed that his child was taken by the Jews, 4709. Fattened for 10 days with milk and white bread, and that all of the Jews of England were invited to Lincoln to his crucifixion. A Jew was subsequently arrested and under torture confessed that the Jew people did to the boy what had been done to Jesus. Over 100 Jews were arrested and 19 were hung without trial. Chaucer later wrote about this incident in one of his tales, and many ballads found their way into the popular culture, one as late as 1973 in the United States, written and inspired by the story of Lincoln. In April of 1343, the Jews of Gramsci, Germany, were accused of a ritual murder. The entire town was burned alive at the stake, and these blood Bible myths were often fanned by local clergy who operated very profitable pilgrimages to the sites of the alleged murders. It was claimed that Jewish people murder Christian children to use their blood for ritual purposes, such as baking matzahs for Passover. There were over 150 recorded cases of blood libels against Jews. In almost every case, Jews were murdered by Christian mobs. As late as 1755, Pope Benedict XIV issued a bull stating that Jews murdered Christian children out of hatred for Jesus and out of hatred for the Christian faith. The sickening canard has had a very long shelf life, according to the church historian James Parks. Among Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians in Central Eastern Europe, there were more accusations of ritual murder between 1880 and 1945 than during the entire Middle Ages. The entire May 1st, 1934 edition of the Nazi publication De Schirmer was devoted to the charge of Jewish ritual murder, and the regular weekly paper regularly illustrations of rabbis sucking blood of German children. Examples of publications giving credence to the charge of ritual murder were found in the United States as late as the 1960s, page 7. Another feature of the Jewish life in the Middle Ages was having to endure forced sermons by Christian clergy in synagogues and having to participate in forced disputations. The Jews were required to dispute or debate with church officials. They were often not allowed to speak their mind. They were tremendously restricted, and often these disputations led to the expulsion of the Jewish people after the Jewish people won the debates, and followed by the burning of the Talmud. After one such debate, King Louis the Ninth of France forced the Jewish communities to give up their copies of the Talmud. In 1242, 24 cartloads of approximately 12,000 Jewish books were burnt in Paris for his efforts. A church canonized him as a saint in 1297. There were many other such public burnings of the Talmud that followed in other parts of France, Italy, and England, and the church also launched a massive campaign not just to burn Talmuds, but to censor them. Virtually all books were heavily censored by the church. The last public burning of the Talmud took place in Poland in 1757, when 1,000 volumes were thrown into a pit and burned. It's not coincidental, by the way, that the Nazis, when they came into Berlin, burned down the entire Jewish library. There was one of the greatest Jewish libraries in the world, containing 55,000 volumes, went up in smoke when the Nazis came to Lublin. Now, after the Christians reconquered Spain from the Muslims in the 13th century, the Dominican friars launched an all-out campaign to either convert, exile, or kill the Jewish population in Spain. There were massive pressure that brought to bear on the Jews: economic pressure, bribes, forced sermons, forced debates, threats of death. And in the 1390s, there were hateful sermons against Jews. And by 1390, the synagogue of Seville were shut down. In 1391, a huge panic broke out and spread through Spain and Portugal. It destroyed over 70 Jewish communities, over 50,000 Jews. By 1412, Spanish Jewry was ruling as a result of this pressure, and tens of thousands of Jews converted. However, the Spanish did not necessarily trust all these Jews, that they suspected they were secretly practicing Judaism, so that in 1480, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain established a tribunal, established a church of those who clung to their Jewish faith, and to safeguard the church from Jewish influence. The Inquisition, as it was called, was searching for heretical practices among those who had converted to Christianity. These heretical practices included the failure to eat pork, not working on Saturday, not wearing one's best clothing on Sunday, observing the biblical feast, observing the Jewish dietary laws, saying any Jewish prayers, observing any Jewish customs of any kind, associating with the non-baptized Jews. Of all that were caused to be pulled up on charges before the Inquisition. The Inquisition, you should know, continued until the 19th century throughout Central and Western Europe, finally coming to the New World as well. And the first public burning of a Jew in America took place in 1574 in America. Now, when someone was accused of heresy by the Inquisition, their property could be confiscated, and those accused would be harshly tortured. The rack, often used as a way of extracting confessions. Mock trials were held of people brought up on charges. If they were sentenced to death, and they were renounced their heresies and publicly proclaimed the Christian faith, then the church would show them mercy and first strangle them to death before burning them. Otherwise, they were simply burnt alive on a cross. In 1485, the fires destroyed the Jewish communities of Toledo and then Barcelona and Saragossa. In 1488, it's estimated that between 30,000 and 50,000 Spanish Jews were burned at the stake during the Inquisition between the 15th century and 1808. In March of 1942, an edict of expulsion against the Jews of Spain was pushed by the chief inquisitor, Thomas Tata. It was signed in Granada, and on May 1st, Spain began to expel all Jews who would not convert. And here, I was not able to get any kind of agreement, historical sources. Some sources say that over 150 to 170,000 Jews were forced out of Spain. I saw other history books reporting between 300,000 and 700,000 Jews leaving Spain. So it's a pretty big gap here. I'm not sure quite what the accurate number is, but in any event, hundreds of thousands of Jews left the land. They went wandering through Europe, Portugal, North Africa, and Turkey. They were not allowed to take any of their property or possessions. They were forced to sell them literally for nothing. And tens of thousands died at sea. Many of them fled to Portugal, but they were later expelled from Portugal as well. Tens of thousands who were baptized in order to escape all the persecution were always living under constant suspicion in Spain. And by July 31st, 1492, Spain was officially emptied of all Jews. Historians, that by the way, have recorded that about 108 Christian expulsions of Jews from the expulsions of the Jews from their land since the year 250, the Common Era. But I do want to mention one more thing before we move on, is the way that the church managed to infect the beliefs and the thinking of the average churchgoer. You should know that during the Middle Ages, many people were illiterate. They weren't literate to reading Christian tongues or even the New Testament. So the church was able to reinforce vicious anti-Jewish stereotypes was through the use of art and literature. In the Passion plays that were presented, there was a very effective platform for church sponsored anti-Semitic education, indoctrination. We all know that a picture is worth 1,000 words, so much more powerful than reading a passage in the Christian Bible. They would see a reenactment of the torture and persecution of Jesus by the wicked Jews. And you can assume that the wicked way of the Jews were presented in these Passion plays, greatly exaggerated, even though it was written about them in the Christian Bible. We know that throughout Middle Ages, artwork paintings always portray the Jewish people as ugly and satanic, with huge noses, convening eyes, features of the devil, and there were many, many paintings that were done to contrast the victorious church to vanquish Israel. Many, many famous paintings show Israel represented by someone who is blindfolded, because the Jews are presented as being blind. Their crown is falling off their head, their staff is broken, their head is bent over in submission, and next to them is the church where they're standing straight with a crown and a scepter and a triumphant. This was a constant theme of medieval Christian art, to show the degradation of the ugly demonic Jew and the triumph of the church. And this took place not in paintings and passion plays, but in popular theaters such as Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, which again propagated stereotypes about Jews. This type of propaganda through art and literature was very powerful in indoctrinating Christian lay people. Into modern times, we'll begin now with the Protestant Reformation. There was a significant revolution in the world of Christendom, and when Martin Luther King in the 16th century was scandalized by the conduct of the Catholic Church, he presented his Reformation as a way to clean up the world of Christianity, and he criticized the Catholic Church in 1523 for their treatment of the Jews. He wrote the following: "Perhaps I will attract some of the Jews to the Christian faith. For our fools, the popes, the bishops, and the monks, those coarse blockheads, have until this time so treated the Jews that if I had been a Jew and had seen such idiots and blockheads ruling and teaching the Christian religion, I would rather have been a sow than a Christian, for they have dealt with the Jews as if they were dogs and not human beings." This is what Martin Luther writes in 1523. However, mere 20 years later, when the Jewish people did not convert, Martin Luther turned viciously on them. In 1543, he published his notorious book on the Jews and their lies, which Paul Johnson terms the first work of modern anti-Semitism and a giant step forward on the road to the Holocaust. Luther writes the following: "First, the synagogues of the Jews of the Jews should be set on fire. Whatever is left behind should be burnt in dirt, so that buried in dirt, so that no one may ever be able to see a stone or a cinder of it. Secondly, the homes of the Jews should likewise be broken down and destroyed. Thirdly, Jews should be deprived of their prayer books and Talmuds. Fourth, rabbis must be forbidden under threat of death to teach any more. Fifth, passport and traveling privileges should be absolutely forbidden to the Jews. Sixthly, they must be stopped from money lending. Seventh, their property should be seized. And then these poisonous envenomed worms should be drafted into forced labor and made to earn their bread by the sweat of their brows. Luther ultimately advised giving all Jews a choice between converting to Christianity and having their tongues torn out. Luther later wrote, "Verily, hapless, wicked, venomous, and devilish thing is the existence of Jews, who over 1400 years, who have been and still are pest, torment, and misfortune. They are just devils and nothing more. Dear Christian," he advised, "do not doubt that next to the devil you have no more bitter, venomous, and vehement foe than a real Jew who earnestly seeks to be a Jew, and their lineage and circumcision infect them all Jewish. A Jewish heart is as hard as stone, and iron cannot be moved by any means, even if the Jews were punished in the most gruesome manner, that the streets ran with blood, so that their dead would be counted not in the hundreds of thousands, but in the millions. It would still not be possible to convert these children of the devil." Luther, by the way, was not content with only writing against the Jews. Even before publishing his book, he had the Jews expelled from Saxony in 1537, and in the 1540s, he drove Jews out of many other German towns. By the way, Luther's theological opponent at the time, the famous Christian humanist Erasmus, did not really differ from when it came to the Jews. Erasmus wrote, "Who is there among us who does not hate this race of men? It is a Christian to hate the Jews, and here we are all Christians." Moving on in history, and again, I have to skip almost everything, just giving you, unfortunately, a horrible taste of this. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, more of them same. In the late 16th century, ghettos were introduced in Italy and then to the Austrian Empire. In 1648 to 1653, huge mobs of Greek Orthodox peasant Cossacks led by Bagan Kikiliski went on rampage and murdered more than 200,000 Jews in 300 Polish communities after they refused to convert to Christianity. With the partition of Poland in the 18th century, over 600,000 Jews were added to the Russian territory. By 1800, there were now 1,350,000 Jews under the control of czars. The Jews in Russia were restricted to living in the palace settlement. There were harsh economic conditions and restrictions placed upon the Jews. They ultimately became impoverished. The intent of the czars from the outset was to get them to either convert or to leave. Virtually no one converted. In 1827, the decree of the canonists took place, where children as young as 12 years of age were taken from their homes for 25 years of military service. Their training was meant not just to train them as soldiers, but to strip them of their Jewishness and pressure them into embracing Christianity. Many died of malnourishment, mistreatment, and less than one half of them ever returned home. There were sporadic instances of host execution, and the blood libel occurring in the 18th and 19th century. In 1761, the city of Nancy, several Jews were executed on these grounds. Blood libels broke out in Damascus. Anti-Semitism rose dramatically in Hungary. after an exact accusation of ritual murder against the Jews in a small village in 1982. Russia were very similar to the actions of the Crusaders against Jewish communities in Europe. Moscow was finally cleansed of all of its Jews in 1891. The Tsar, who held a position of both political and religious authority, stated, "But we have never forgot that the Jews have crucified and have shed his precious blood." The Russian persecutions in the Ukraine saw tens of thousands of Jews murdered, and in 1917, Russian Revolution brought as many between 70,000 and 200 Jewish lives were lost in the Russian Revolution. Under the Russian Tsars, the notorious forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was produced. Page 11. There was a Jesuit journal called Civilta Cattolica, which was sponsored and controlled by the Vatican. It conducted a racist, anti-Semitic campaign beginning in the late 1800s, continuing until at least 1945. In 1880, Father Giuseppe wrote, "The Jews, eternal, insolent children, obstinate, dirty thieves, liars, are a barbarian invasion by the enemy race, hostile to Christianity and to society in general." The famous Dreyfus affair, the French soldier Dreyfus, who was accused of treason for betraying France, was forced to spend 5 years in brutal, inhumane, solitary confinement on Devil's Island, when it was finally revealed that he was framed and that someone else was guilty in betraying France. The retrial of Dreyfus basically tore French society in half, and those who supported Dreyfus and those who were against Dreyfus. And at the time, there were 20,000 French Catholics who wrote that they planned to flay and butcher and boil the Jewish vampires alive and to bake them in ovens. Still into the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, the hatred does not abate. Into the 20th century, a leading Protestant churchman, Bishop Martin Sasse, published a compendium of Martin Luther's anti-Semitic vitriol shortly after 1938. In the forward, he applauded the burnings of the synagogues and the coincidence of that day on November 19th, 1938, on Luther's birthday, or may have been November 10th. I made a mistake here. Here on Luther's birthday, 1938, the synagogues are burning in Germany, he gloated. The German people need to heed the words of the greatest anti-Semite of his time, the warner of his people against the Jews. We know that nearly every Nazi administrative order against the Jews, from yellow badges to forced ghettos, defamations, deportations, to round up the slaughters, all had their precedent in Christian West. Millions of Jews had already been murdered, and the church and the theologians was formulated. You can let five more. Saw the Jews as less than human, or even as inhuman, as devilish, as the satanic. They proclaimed the Jews as traitors, murderers, plague, pollution, filth, and insects, long before the Nazis called the Jews in the same terms. In 1934, after Hitler had seen and watched a passion play, he declared that the whole world over should see this passion play. Then they will understand why I despise the Jews, why they deserve to die. Elias Bovitz wrote in his incredibly important book, Faith After the Holocaust, that after the 19th centuries, the Christianity extermination of 6 million Jews, among them and 1.5 million children, carried out in cold blood in the very heart of a Christian Europe, encouraged by criminal silence of virtually all of Christendom, including the infallible Holy Father in Rome. It was all natural culmination of the spiritual bankruptcy of the Christian of the Christian religion. A straight line leads from the first act of oppression against the Jews and Judaism in the 4th century to the Holocaust in the 20th century. Many authors have said and have written that the Holocaust did not erupt in a vacuum. It was only centuries of Christian antipathy that helped implant a cultural seed where German racial anti-Semitism could grow. A Holocaust would have been unthinkable without 2,000 years of Christian history and hatred and persecution. In 1933, the Lutheran Gerechtelt, one of the history's greatest theologians and New Testament scholars, wrote a book on how Germany should deal with its Jewish problem. He wrote, extermination would be impractical. Zionism, not possible. Assimilation would corrupt the German race and would be the worst solution at all. Rather, he said, the Jews would have to accept discrimination and defamation as their fate. They would have to be second class by leaker guests in some foreign land, and they need to be dispersed, strangers wandering restless and homeless on the face of this earth. This is one of the great Lutheran scholars of this time. Even the beloved and martyred Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was martyred for his opposition to Hitler, held deep prejudices against the Jews. In 1939, he wrote, the Church of Christ has never lost sight of the thought of the chosen people who nailed the Redeemer of the world to the cross, must bear a curse for its actions through a long history of suffering. One of the most implacable foes of Jews is the Catholic priest named Tiso from Slovakia. He was very anxious to get rid of all the Jews in his area. Before Passover in 1942, one of the leading rabbis in this area approached Archbishop Kroko, and who he had known. He tried to have him intervene with Tiso. He was told by his friend the following: "This is no mere expulsion. There in Poland, you will not die of hunger or pestilence. They will slaughter you all, old, young, women, and children in one day. This is your punishment for the death of our Redeemer. There's only one hope for you to convert all of you to our religion. Then I shall effect the anointing of this decree." These are the leaders of the churches. Another rabbi was able to escape from his transport from Auschwitz and went to the residence of Natiso. This is what he was told: "This being a Sunday is a holy day for us. Neither I nor the Father Tiso occupy ourselves with profane matters on this day." He said, "There is no innocent blood of Jewish children in the entire world. All Jewish blood is guilty. You have to die. This is the punishment that has been waiting for you because of that sin." Martin Gilbert wrote an important book on the history of the Holocaust and reported on a massacre of Jews in Poland took place on September 2nd, 1942. The Polish police who took part in this massacre spoke of how, after machine gunning thousands of Jewish men, women, and children and throwing their bodies into mass graves, they then went to church on the following Sunday morning with their families as if nothing had ever even happened. They suffered no feelings of guilt. After all, they were only murdering Jews with the blessings of their priests who inflamed them from the pulpits on Sundays. At a war crimes trial in 1958, a Lithuanian minister was asked why he remained silent in the face of all the terrible shootings that he had witnessed. His reply was that he believed the scripture verse was being fulfilled, which said, "May his blood be on us and on our children." Here in Canada, Irving Abella and Harold Trooper wrote a large book, None is Too Many, claiming that Canadian churches practiced silence as Canada callously closed its doors to Jewish refugees during the 1930s and 1940s. This silence of the Canadian churches was later confirmed in another book by Alan Davies and Marilyn A mesquite called How Silent Were the Churches? Canadian Protestantism and Jewish Plight During the Nazi Era. In the wake of Kristall, 1939, John Inkster, who was a minister of Knox Presbyterian Church in Toronto, suggested that Jews were not blameless for the Holocaust because they had failed to embrace Christianity. There was a famous incident where a Protestant minister, Bishop Hull, visited 14 times in jail in order to try and convert him into Christianity and save his soul from going to hell. He later gave an interview to a Toronto newspaper, and he said that the 6 million victims from the Nazis were doomed to perish in hell and would not enter paradise because they had not accepted Jesus as their Messiah. He also said that crimes were not as great as those of the average person who denies Jesus as the Redeemer. Even though the Holocaust was the most extreme manifestation of Jew hatred in the 20th century, unfortunately, it wasn't the only manifestation of Jewish hatred in the 20th century. In 1903, there was a pogrom in Kishinev, which began after a Christian boy was found dead, and Jews of Kishinev were accused of using his blood for Passover matzahs. 49 Jews were killed, hundreds were wounded, 700 homes were looted and destroyed. In 1913, in Kiev, there was a sensational trial of Mel Bells for murdering a Christian child and using his blood for matzah. In 1928, the Jews of Messina, New York, were accused of kidnapping and killing a Christian girl. During the 1930s in the United States, the Catholic priest Coffin broadcasted unrelenting hatred of Jews during his extreme popular radio program. During 1944 to 1946, anti-Jewish violence in Poland killed between 1,000 and 2,000 Jews after blood libel accusations were leveled against them. In 1946, there was a pogrom in Kielce, Poland against Holocaust survivors, and it was sparked by an accusation of ritual murder. We have a synagogue here in Toronto that is named for the community in Kielce. In the 1960s, Charles Glock and Rodney Stark polled American Catholics and Protestants. Despite all the progress in economical harmony, they found that half of those interviewed believed that all Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus and that they could not be forgiven until they converted to Christianity, and that God punishes the Jews because they rejected Jesus, and the Jews are responsible for their own suffering. On August 22nd, 1980, Reverend Miley Smith, the head of the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant convent denomination of the United States, publicly announced that God does not hear the prayers of a Jew. The idea that 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust has been questioned by many Christian writers and clergy over the past 40 years. A bishop in a traditional Catholic church in Quebec asserted that the Holocaust may be a very big lie. Over the last number of years, evangelical leaders, including the late Jerry Falwell and the highly influential Pat Robertson, who even ran for U.S. president in the 80s, had invoked anti-Jewish stereotypes of Jews controlling the media and Jewish bankers being part of a worldwide conspiracy aimed at global domination. In the years between 1997 and 2004, the number of Americans who professed the belief that the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus rose dramatically between 1997 and 2004. According to research done by Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C., among people under the age of 30, 34% believe that the Jews responsible, up threefold from the 10% who thought that in 1997. Overall, among all age groups, the percentage went up from 19% to 26%. What might account for this rise in numbers? The study was done shortly after the release of Mel Gibson's film, The Passion of the Christ, which embellish this already anti-Semitic Gospels accounts with the visions of various Christian mystics that had Jewish children morphing into devils and other ugly Jewish stereotypes. That had Jewish children morphing into devils and other ugly Jewish stereotypes. Vicious anti-Semitism exists today in all branches of the Christian identity churches, and there is no lack of crude anti-Jewish sentiment being spewed regularly today in print and electronic media from hate-filled Christian ministers like the Reverend Ted Pike. I'm on his mailing list. I read his garbage. Pastor Mark Downey, who recently published an article listing 29 reasons why Christians should hate Jews, and Brother Nathaniel, by the way, another converted Jew who is a big Jew hater today. In the year 2005, 20 members of the Russian State Duma leveled a public blood libel against the Jewish people. In 2005, in 2008, a Polish team of anthropologists and sociologists discovered that beliefs in blood libel myths still persist among Catholics and Orthodox Christians of all social classes in Poland. The Jews were accused of killing Jesus. What one wonders, who really killed Jesus by ignoring and perverting his teachings and by stripping him all of his Jewishness. Think of the fact that Jesus proclaimed he didn't come to do away with the Torah, that Jesus was someone who observed the Torah, who wore tzitzits, who told Jewish people to keep the Torah. And what happens to this poor Jew living 2,000 years ago? He is turned within a short period of time into someone who is no longer seen as a Jew. He's represented as someone from Iceland or Holland with long blonde hair. And for so many hundreds of years, most Christians were not aware of the fact that Jesus was a Jew. And here Jesus, who taught his followers, again, he said these words, "Father, forgive me, they know not what they do." And here you have 2,000 years of people basically perverting and ignoring all of his teachings, to destroying his identity, stripping him of all his Jewishness. Who really did kill Jesus? The Jews or his own followers? During the Shoah, as we just learned, during the Holocaust, most Christian churches and Christians either stood by in silence or actually collaborated with other Christians in murdering Jews. So most Christians became involved directly or indirectly with what they claimed to have despised, which are murderous Cains. It was the Jew who was described as the murderous Cain, but who really has been the murderous Cain over the last 2,000 years. The old expression goes that when you point your finger at someone, you have the three fingers pointing back at yourself. And one wonders, when the Christian church fathers and theologians during the past 2,000 years who accused the Jewish people at the most ugliest things possible, were they really describing themselves more than they were describing their opponents? It's also no credit to Christianity that so many of the evil canard that they spread over the past 2,000 years have now been picked up and used by Islamic extremists. So, while today you may not hear many church leaders advocating the idea that Jewish killed children to use matzahs for blood, this is widely circulated in Arab and Muslim cultures. They didn't get out of thin air. This is the kind of evil and libel and slander they were able to very easily cherry pick from their Christian predecessors. Franklin Mattel, who wrote a very important book called The Crucifixion of Jews. Littell was a professor at Temple University associated with the National Council of Churches and National Council of Catholic Bishops, wrote, "The murder of 6 million Jews by baptized Christians from whom membership in good standing was not and has not yet been withdrawn. None of these people was ever excommunicated for being part of the Holocaust. He said, raised the most insistent question about the credibility of Christianity. In Matthew 7, chapter 7, verse 16, Jesus says, you will know them by their fruits. You will know them by their fruits. And 2 verses later, he says, a good tree cannot produce bad fruit. One wonders about the credibility of Christianity and the entire Christian enterprise if what is produced over the past 2,000 years has been so incredibly ugly and vicious. Something probably was not 100% kosher at the court. Finally, one final thought here. Rosemary Ruther, or Wyther, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, wrote the following. She says, possibly anti-Judaism is too deeply embedded in the foundations of Christianity to be rooted out entirely without destroying the whole structure. Let me repeat what she says. Perhaps anti-Judaism is too deeply embedded in the foundations of Christianity to be rooted out entirely without destroying the entire structure. I would disagree. I think that it's possible that it could be rooted out, and I would suggest that we are seeing the movement in history where it may be indeed rooted out. The entire conflict between the church and the Jewish people, as I had mentioned earlier tonight, developed because the church moved away from its Jewish roots. It moved away from its Jewish roots. Paul abandons Judaism and starts a new religion, starts a new one, which is diametrically opposed to Judaism, and it's called Christianity. During the development of this new religion, there are some serious diversions from Judaism. One is the worship of a human being. They worship a human being, where the earliest followers of Jesus merely thought he was a Messiah. Historical Christianity came to see Jesus as God in the flesh. According to Judaism, this is idolatry. This is the worst mistake you can make theologically, to worship a creation of God rather than only the Creator. The second greatest mistake of Christianity was to strip it of its connection to the Torah, to strip that not just from Christianity, but from Jesus himself. And I believe that's what's happening today, is possibly that the church is beginning to re-examine itself. The church is beginning to look at where it came from. Many thinking Christians today are studying their own Bible with an eye asking this question: who really was Jesus? Was Jesus more like Thor the Viking, or was Jesus more like some 2nd century rabbi? And I think that what many Christians are coming to realize is that the kind of Jesus that they have been worshiping for 2,000 years may have very little to do with the Jesus who walked 2,000 years ago. The Jewish Bible says in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 4 that one day all the nations of the world are going to come to accept the beauty and the wisdom of the commandments of the Torah. For 2,000 years, Christianity has attacked the Torah, has negated the performance of the mitzvot, and Paul says in the book of Galatians, if you become circumcised, then Christ is of no benefit to you. Paul kept on repeating his charge that you are no longer under the curse of the Torah, and I believe that now more and more Christians are beginning to explore the Torah, to read a chapter like Psalm 119, which 176 verses speaks about the glory of the Torah, the beauty of the commandments, how delicious they are, how sweet they are, how precious they are. And I believe that the church is beginning to say, maybe we might have went off course 2,000 years ago in our negation of the Torah. The book of Zechariah, chapter 8:23 says, in the future, at some time before the Messianic age commences, that people from all over the world are going to grab hold of a Jew and say to the Jew, we want to follow. We have heard that God is with you. Now, today more and more Christians are turning to Jesus and saying, we just want to know, we just want to worship Hashem, the Creator. We don't want to worship any intermediary human. We don't want to worship a human being. And there's a movement among Christians that is rethinking that the idea that Jesus was God in the flesh. Maimonides wrote famously that possibly one of the reasons that God allowed Christianity to spread was a way of preparing the world for the ultimate Messiah to come. Maimonides suggests that if the Messiah showed up to a world that was pagan, they would not know who he was or what he was talking about. And so possibly Maimonides suggests that the spread of Christianity and Islam, basically to become the dominant religions of the world, are seeding the world with Jewish ideas. Now Maimonides says that the world, he wrote 700 years ago, and now the world is familiar with the Jewish Bible. Now the world is familiar with Jewish concepts like Torah and Messiah. And so when the Messiah finally does come, it won't be irrelevant to a world that exists or lives among the daughter religions of Judaism. For as long as these daughters of religion of Judaism have been acting out a violent edible reaction to their parent religion for 2,000 years in order to deal with the contradiction between Judaism and their religion, there has been hate. But I believe, at least in the Christian world at this point, that they were speaking out. I can't speak at this point for what's going on in the Islamic world. But many Christians are beginning to rethink who they are, who is Jesus, what is Christianity, what is the relationship to Judaism. And I believe that there is a possibility that they will be able to make this evaluation. They will be able to ultimately come to possibly what Jesus may have been actually teaching. The primary teaching of Jesus was the kingdom of God is at hand. He never taught any of the official doctrines of Christianity. He basically taught that the kingdom of God is at hand and that people could hasten his coming by living righteously, by repenting, by changing their ways. Shuvah. And I believe that the possibility exists within the not too distant future. We may see more and more people in the world of Christianity return to the teachings of their mother religion, either to embrace Judaism or to embrace Noahide path, and to rid themselves of their anti-Jewish prejudices, to really come to a deep appreciation and a love for the parent they gave birth.
That's life. That's what all the people say.